Every Sunday at 7:30, lemon polish and a gleaming Bible promised purity. Behind closed doors, bruises hidden, files locked, whispers labeled sacred. When a 14-year-old spoke, they branded her rebellious and tried to erase her. Today, I pull back the curtain on the system that turns faith into armor and victims into evidence gone missing. The smell of lemon polish still makes my stomach turn. Every Sunday morning at 7:30 sharp, Dad would polish the mahogany Bible stand that sat in our living room like an altar. The leather-bound New World Translation would be perfectly positioned, its gold-edged pages catching the morning light streaming through our spotless windows. To anyone walking past our suburban home in Portland, Oregon, we looked like the perfect Christian family. My name is Rebecca Matthews, and I'm 63 years old now. Back in the early 1970s, when I was just 12, our neighbors would often comment on how blessed our family seemed. Dad, Harold Matthews, was one of the most respected elders in our Kingdom Hall. He gave powerful talks about spiritual purity, family headship, and godly discipline. Other fathers in the congregation would ask him for advice about raising children. "Brother Harold has such a well-behaved daughter," they'd say, watching me sit quietly during meetings, my hands folded, my dress perfectly pressed. If only they knew what happened when the Kingdom songs stopped playing and our front door closed. Our house was a shrine to appearances. The Watchtower and Awake magazines were arranged in perfect stacks on the coffee table. Dad's elder handbook was locked in his study, along with files of congregation business that he'd bring home. "Sacred confidential matters," he'd call them, his voice dropping to that tone that meant I shouldn't ask questions. Mom, Patricia, would nod respectfully whenever he spoke, her eyes never quite meeting his. Every Tuesday evening, our living room transformed into a meeting place for Dad's shepherding calls. I'd watch from the hallway as other families would come seeking guidance. Young couples with marriage problems, struggling single mothers, teenagers who'd been caught smoking behind the Kingdom Hall. Dad would sit behind his polished desk, his reading glasses perched on his nose, dispensing wisdom with the authority of someone who spoke for God himself. "The Bible says children must honor their parents," I'd hear him tell a 14-year-old boy whose mother complained about his attitude. "Disobedience to parents is disobedience to Jehovah." The boy would leave, looking properly chastened, and I'd retreat to my room, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach. Sundays were performance days. I'd wake to the sound of Dad's electric razor humming in the bathroom, followed by the splash of aftershave that would linger in the hallway. Mom would lay out my meeting clothes, a modest dress, usually navy or brown, with sleeves that covered my shoulders and a hemline that touched my knees. No bright colors, no patterns that might distract from worship. "Rebecca, honey," Mom would call softly. "Breakfast is ready." Her voice always had that careful, measured quality on meeting mornings, as if she was walking on glass. Dad required punctuality. Being late for a meeting was being late for an appointment with God, he'd remind us. I remember one particular Sunday in November 1973, when the autumn rain was beating against our kitchen window. I was reading the Watchtower study article while eating my toast. Dad insisted we prepare ahead so we could give meaningful comments during the meeting. The lesson was about family relationships, about how children should submit to parental authority without question. "Rebecca," Dad said, not looking up from his own magazine, "I want you to comment on paragraph 12 today, about children trusting their parents' wisdom even when they don't understand." My fingers tightened around my fork. Paragraph 12 talked about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, about faith that didn't require explanations. "Yes, Dad," I managed to say. "If you're watching this and thinking about subscribing to hear more stories like mine, I'd be grateful for your company. Sometimes sharing these memories feels like opening old wounds, but I've learned that silence only serves those who prefer their secrets kept buried." That particular Sunday, sitting in our Kingdom Hall with its beige carpet and fluorescent lights, I raised my hand during the Watchtower study. When Brother Peterson called on me, I stood and delivered my prepared comment about trusting parental guidance, my voice steady and clear. The congregation nodded approvingly. Sister Williams smiled at me from across the aisle. After the meeting, Brother Thompson approached Dad to compliment him on raising such a spiritually mature daughter. But beneath my pressed dress, my arms bore fresh bruises from the discipline I'd received the night before for asking why women couldn't hold microphones during the meeting. Questioning the organization's arrangements shows a rebellious spirit, Dad had explained. His voice calm and measured, even as his hands left marks that wouldn't show in my Sunday clothes. The car ride home that day was quiet, except for Dad's commentary on the meeting. Brother Jackson's comment about family headship was excellent, he said, adjusting his rearview mirror. Children today don't understand the blessing of having strong spiritual leadership in the home. I stared out the window at the Oregon hills, their autumn colors muted under the gray November sky. Other families were probably going home to Sunday dinners filled with laughter and conversation. We'd go home to another afternoon of silent study and preparation for Tuesday's book study, where Dad would lead our group through the latest publication, his voice never wavering from that tone of absolute certainty. At 12 years old, I was already learning that truth was whatever Dad said it was, and questioning that truth came with consequences that couldn't be hidden beneath modest dresses and meeting shoes. But I was also beginning to understand, in that wordless way children sometimes do, that there was something fundamentally wrong with a God who required silence about suffering, and a father who claimed to speak for him while causing the very pain he preached against. The real lesson wouldn't come from any watchtower study. It would come from learning that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who cloak their cruelty in Scripture, and that finding your voice means risking everything you've been taught to believe about family, faith, and what it means to honor God. Harold Matthews was born in 1925, making him 47 when my story truly begins in 1972. He'd grown up during the Great Depression in a small farming community outside Salem, Oregon, where his own father had ruled their household with an iron fist wrapped in biblical verses. Dad often spoke about his childhood during family study nights, painting pictures of a simpler time when children respected their elders and families stuck together through hardship. "My father never had to tell me twice to do something," Dad would say, his eyes taking on that distant look that meant we were about to hear another lesson about proper family order. Children back then understood their place. We didn't have this modern rebellion that's destroying families today. What he didn't mention was how his father's discipline had left scars that went deeper than skin. I learned this years later from my Aunt Dorothy, Dad's younger sister, who'd escaped their childhood home at 17 and never looked back. "Your father learned to survive by becoming exactly what our father wanted," she told me during a brief phone conversation in 1995, her voice heavy with decades of regret. Harold was the good son, the one who never questioned, never fought back, but that kind of survival comes with a price. Dad had become a Jehovah's Witness in 1950, shortly after returning from the Korean War. He rarely spoke about his military service, except to say that God had used those experiences to show him the futility of worldly solutions to human problems. "Only God's kingdom can bring true peace," he'd tell the young men in our congregation who were facing decisions about military service or higher education. "Everything else is just polishing the brass on a sinking ship." Mom, Patricia Rose Kendall, before she married Dad in 1953, came from a completely different background. Her family had been witnesses for 3 generations, and she'd been raised with the gentle, nurturing approach that characterized many of the older families in the organization during those earlier decades. She was 21 when she married Dad, barely out of her teenage years, with dreams of pioneering, spending her days in door-to-door ministry, and raising children who would grow up to serve Jehovah faithfully. "Your mother was the prettiest girl in the circuit," Brother Williams had told me once, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he poured coffee after a district assembly. Every single brother was hoping to court her, but she only had eyes for Harold. He could quote more scripture than any young man we'd ever seen. Mom's transformation from that hopeful young woman to the quietly fearful person I knew was gradual, like watching a flower slowly wither under too much shade. By the time I was old enough to notice, she'd developed a habit of pausing before speaking, as if mentally checking each word for potential offense. Her laughter, when it came at all, sounded careful and measured. "Patricia, dear," I'd hear Dad say during their quiet conversations in the kitchen, "I think you misunderstood what Brother Peterson was saying about headship. Let me help clarify that for you." His tone was always patient, educational, the way a teacher might correct a struggling student. Mom would nod and thank him, but I noticed how her shoulders would tense whenever he began these clarifications. Our daily routine was orchestrated with military precision. Dad woke at 5:30 every morning, shaved, dressed in one of his 3 suits, navy, charcoal, or brown, and spent exactly 30 minutes reading the daily text before breakfast. Mom would have coffee ready by 6:15, along with toast cut diagonally and orange juice in the small glasses she'd received as a wedding gift. A godly household requires order, Dad would remind us whenever our schedule was disrupted by unexpected events. Disorder leads to spiritual weakness, and spiritual weakness opens doors for Satan's influence. Breakfast conversation followed a predictable pattern. Dad would share insights from his morning reading, explain the day's theocratic activities, and assign our individual responsibilities. Rebecca, I want you to prepare 3 comments for tonight's book study. And remember, personal opinions aren't appropriate during meetings. We comment to reinforce the organization's teachings, not to share our own thoughts. I learned early that having my own thoughts was problematic. When I was 10, I'd raised my hand during a Watchtower study to ask why only men could be elders if women like Deborah had judged Israel in Bible times. The question seemed logical to my child's mind. If God had used women in leadership positions before, why not now? Dad's face had flushed slightly, but his voice remained controlled. That's not an appropriate question for a young sister to ask during the meeting, he'd said quietly, just loud enough for nearby families to hear. We'll discuss this at home. The discussion at home had involved a lengthy explanation about God's arrangement for family headship, followed by what Dad called corrective discipline. Questions that challenge the organization's understanding show a proud spirit, he'd explained while applying his belt to my legs. Pride comes before a fall, Rebecca. I'm helping you develop humility before it's too late. Mom had stood in the doorway during these sessions, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes focused on some point beyond my shoulder. Afterward, she'd bring me a warm washcloth and help me apply the ointment that would prevent the marks from showing, but she never spoke about what had happened. Silence was her survival strategy, and she was teaching me to embrace it as mine. The object that symbolized our family dynamic most perfectly was Dad's leather portfolio, a rich burgundy leather folder that he carried to every meeting, every assembly, every shepherding call. Inside were his elder notes, congregation records, copies of letters from the branch office, and his personal study materials. That portfolio represented his authority, his direct connection to God's earthly organization. Never touch Dad's portfolio, Mom had warned me when I was 6, catching me looking at it curiously as it sat on his desk. Those are sacred responsibilities that only qualified brothers can handle. The portfolio would rest on Dad's nightstand each evening, positioned precisely parallel to the edge of the furniture. Sometimes I'd see him reviewing its contents late at night, his reading lamp casting long shadows across the bedroom wall. Those papers contained the private struggles of congregation members, marital problems, disciplinary matters, requests for help with spiritual weakness. Brother Matthews, I'd overhear on phone calls, we need your wisdom about a delicate situation. Dad would listen intently, occasionally making notes in his careful handwriting, before offering guidance that sounded both compassionate and firm. Remember, we want to restore our brother, not destroy him. But we also can't compromise Jehovah's standards. Our home served as an unofficial extension of the Kingdom Hall. The dining room table, which seated 8, regularly hosted elder meetings, circuit overseer visits, and what Dad called encouragement visits for struggling families. Mom would prepare elaborate meals for these occasions, using her good china and the tablecloth she'd embroidered during the early years of their marriage. Sister Matthews set such a beautiful table, the circuit overseer's wife would comment, admiring the careful arrangement of serving dishes and folded napkins. A true example of Christian hospitality. These gatherings revealed another layer of Dad's personality, his ability to be simultaneously warm and controlling, encouraging and manipulative. He'd listen to other families share their problems with apparent empathy, nodding thoughtfully and asking gentle questions that seemed designed to help. But I began to notice patterns in his advice. Solutions always involved increased submission to organizational authority, more meeting attendance, deeper commitment to theocratic activities. The key to spiritual strength is putting kingdom interests first, he'd tell a young couple struggling with financial pressures. If we seek first the kingdom, everything else will be added. Perhaps you should consider whether that second job is really necessary, or whether it's interfering with meeting attendance and field service. Young people in our congregation often sought Dad's counsel about education, career choices, and marriage decisions. He had a reputation for being practical and wise, someone who understood how to balance spiritual priorities with real-world responsibilities. What they didn't see was how he manipulated their concerns to reinforce organizational control over individual decision-making. College education can be spiritually dangerous, he'd warned teenage boys who expressed interest in higher learning. The world's philosophy sounds appealing, but it leads away from truth. Better to learn a trade and pioneer while you're young. You can always pursue education later if Jehovah's will permits. The contradiction between Dad's public persona and private behavior created a constant state of cognitive dissonance that shaped my entire childhood. The man who counseled other fathers about patience and understanding would come home and explode at Mom for serving dinner 5 minutes late. The elder who preached about Christian love would methodically punish me for infractions as minor as forgetting to replace a book exactly where I'd found it. Consistency in small things leads to faithfulness in large things, he'd explain during these corrections, his voice never rising above a conversational level. If you can't be trusted to maintain order in simple household matters, how can you be trusted with greater spiritual responsibilities? By my 13th birthday in 1974, I'd developed an acute awareness of the subtle signs that indicated Dad's mood and the corresponding adjustments Mom and I needed to make. A particular way he cleared his throat meant dinner conversation should be minimal. A certain set to his shoulders when he returned from elder meetings meant we should avoid making any requests or raising any concerns. A specific tone in his voice during family study meant that questions would be unwelcome. The most dangerous times were when Dad felt his authority had been questioned, either at home or in the congregation. These episodes would begin with what seemed like theological discussions, but would gradually evolve into comprehensive reviews of our family's spiritual condition, with particular attention to areas where Mom and I were falling short of biblical standards. I've been thinking about our family's progress in the truth, he'd announce during these sessions, his portfolio open in front of him, filled with notes about our meeting attendance, field service hours, and personal study habits. There are some areas where we need to make improvements. These family meetings could last for hours, with Dad methodically explaining how our imperfections were affecting not only our own spiritual welfare, but potentially stumbling others in the congregation. Mom would accept his criticism with quiet nods and promises to do better. I learned to do the same, recognizing that any attempt to defend myself would only extend the ordeal and increase the eventual punishment. The most chilling aspect of Dad's approach was his absolute conviction that everything he did was motivated by love and concern for our eternal welfare. "I don't enjoy having to correct you," he'd say, after particularly severe discipline sessions, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sadness. "But Jehovah disciplines those he loves, and he expects parents to do the same. I'd rather see you cry now than see you destroyed at Armageddon." This framework, punishment as love, control as protection, silence as spiritual virtue, would shape my understanding of relationships for decades to come. It would take years of therapy and careful rebuilding to understand that love doesn't require fear, that protection doesn't demand submission, and that true spirituality encourages questions rather than silencing them. The first crack in my carefully constructed silence appeared on a rainy Thursday evening in March 1975, during our book study group meeting. We were studying a publication about family life, and the lesson that night focused on the biblical principle of headship. 23 adults and children crowded into our living room, their faces illuminated by the warm lamplight, as Dad led the discussion from his position behind the mahogany lectern he'd positioned near the fireplace. Paragraph 14 discusses the beautiful arrangement God has provided for family order. Dad read aloud, his voice carrying the authority that had made him such a respected teacher in our circuit. When each family member accepts their assigned role, peace and harmony naturally result. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 70s who'd been attending our book study for nearly a decade, raised her trembling hand. "Brother Matthews, I sometimes wonder about situations where the family head makes decisions that seem to cause more problems than they solve. What should we do when obedience appears to conflict with common sense?" The room grew noticeably quieter. I watched Dad's jaw tighten slightly, a signal I'd learned to recognize as dangerous, before his practiced smile returned. "Sister Henderson, that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets us into trouble. Common sense is human wisdom, and human wisdom is foolishness to God. When we start second-guessing God's arrangements, we're really questioning God himself." "But surely," Mrs. Henderson persisted, her voice growing softer as she sensed the shift in Dad's tone, "there must be some situations where a wife or child might need to—" "Sister, I think you're missing the point of tonight's lesson," Dad interrupted, his smile never wavering, but his eyes growing cold. "The paragraph clearly explains that questioning headship is really questioning God's wisdom. Are you suggesting that God made a mistake in how he arranged families?" Mrs. Henderson's face flushed pink, and she quickly shook her head. No, of course not, Brother Matthews. I just thought perhaps we should focus on what the organization has provided for our instruction rather than our own thoughts," Dad suggested, his tone gentle but unmistakably corrective. "Personal opinions can lead us away from Bible truth if we're not careful." I watched this exchange from my seat in the corner, feeling something uncomfortable stirring in my chest. Mrs. Henderson had asked what seemed like a reasonable question, but Dad had made her appear foolish and spiritually weak in front of the entire group. The other adults nodded approvingly at his correction, apparently satisfied that order had been restored to the study. But something about the incident bothered me for days afterward. I kept thinking about Mrs. Henderson's question and wondering why it was wrong to ask about situations where following rules might cause more harm than good. The more I thought about it, the more I began to notice similar patterns in other areas of our congregation life. During the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to conversations that happened before and after meetings, listening with new awareness to the whispered discussions that took place in small groups while Dad and the other elders were engaged in their official responsibilities. What I heard began to paint a picture that differed significantly from the harmonious spiritual paradise that was regularly described from the platform. "I don't know what to do anymore," I overheard Sister Morrison telling Sister Campbell in the Kingdom Hall restroom before the midweek meeting. "James says I'm being materialistic for wanting him to look for steady work, but we haven't paid rent in 3 months. The landlord is threatening eviction, but James insists that increasing his pioneer hours is more important than a part-time job." Sister Campbell made sympathetic noises, but her advice was predictably aligned with organizational priorities. "Remember, sister, if we seek first the kingdom, everything else will be added. Perhaps Jehovah is testing your faith in his provision." I wanted to ask why God's provision couldn't include James getting a job to support his family, but I'd learned that such questions were inappropriate for 13-year-old girls to voice. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow as I observed more situations where organizational teachings seemed to create problems rather than solve them. The most disturbing conversations I overheard concerned families dealing with what adults called delicate situations, problems that required discretion and careful handling by the body of elders. Initially, I didn't understand the coded language being used, but gradually I began to piece together stories that made my stomach turn. "Brother Phillips has been disfellowshipped," Sister Wilson whispered to Sister Davis during a circuit assembly in May 1975. "Something about inappropriate conduct with his stepdaughter, but they're not announcing details to protect the family's privacy." "How terrible," Sister Davis responded, her voice dropping even lower. "What will happen to Sister Phillips and the children?" "Well, they'll need to prove their loyalty to the organization by not speaking against the decision. And of course, they can't associate with Brother Phillips anymore, even though he's still living in the house until the divorce is finalized." I didn't fully understand what inappropriate conduct meant, but I understood enough to realize that a man had done something harmful to his stepdaughter, and somehow the focus was on protecting the organization's reputation rather than helping the victim. This seemed fundamentally wrong to me, even though I couldn't articulate why. These conversations created a growing sense of unease that intensified during the summer of 1975, when our circuit overseer, Brother Thompson, visited our congregation for his semi-annual inspection. Brother Thompson was a tall, imposing man in his 50s who spoke with the authority of someone who had direct communication with the organization's headquarters in Brooklyn. His presence during that week transformed the usual dynamics of our congregation meetings. "I want to address a concern that has come to my attention," Brother Thompson announced during the Thursday night service meeting, his voice carrying the weight of official organizational authority. "There are reports of some in this congregation asking questions that could undermine faith in God's arrangement. Questions about the wisdom of following organizational direction. Questions about the qualifications of appointed men. Questions that suggest human wisdom should override divine guidance." His eyes swept across the audience, and I felt certain he was looking directly at me, even though I'd never spoken publicly about my growing concerns. Let me be clear, brothers and sisters. Such questioning is not a sign of spiritual maturity. It's a sign of pride, and pride comes before destruction. The message was unmistakable. Doubt was dangerous. Questions were rebellious, and anyone who struggled with organizational teachings needed to examine their own spiritual condition rather than examining the teachings themselves. But rather than reassuring me, Brother Thompson's warning had the opposite effect. If the truth was really true, why was questioning it so dangerous? My internal conflict reached a critical point during a family study session in late August 1975. We were reviewing material about the organization's expectations for young people, particularly regarding higher education and career planning. The publication emphasized the importance of putting spiritual goals ahead of material advancement, warning that college education could expose young witnesses to dangerous philosophical ideas that might weaken their faith. "Rebecca," Dad said, looking up from the paragraph we'd just read, "you'll be starting high school next year. I want you to understand that your education should focus on basic skills that will help you pioneer and serve the organization. College is unnecessary for young sisters, and it could actually be spiritually harmful." Something inside me rebelled against this statement. I'd been an excellent student throughout elementary and middle school, consistently earning top grades in mathematics and science. My teachers had repeatedly mentioned my potential for advanced education, and I'd begun to dream about studying biology or medicine. The idea that learning was somehow dangerous seemed absurd. "But Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice respectful, "what if Jehovah gave me academic abilities because he wants me to use them? What if I could help people by becoming a doctor or scientist?" The silence that followed my question felt heavy and dangerous. Mom's face went pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. Dad's expression shifted through several stages: surprise, disappointment, and finally, controlled anger. "Rebecca," he said slowly, his voice carrying that tone that meant I was in serious trouble. "That kind of thinking shows exactly why higher education is dangerous. You're beginning to trust your own understanding rather than God's guidance through his organization. Pride is making you think you know better than the faithful and discreet slave." "I'm not trying to be proud," I protested, feeling tears beginning to form in my eyes. "I just don't understand why learning about God's creation would be spiritually harmful. Wouldn't studying science help me appreciate Jehovah's wisdom even more?" Dad closed the study book with a sharp snap and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but something closer to revulsion. "You're questioning the organization's wisdom, Rebecca. That's the same attitude Satan had when he questioned God's right to set standards. Do you want to follow Satan's example?" The comparison to Satan hit me like a physical blow. In our religious framework, being compared to the devil was the ultimate condemnation, the worst possible accusation that could be made against someone's spiritual condition. I began crying, not just from hurt, but from genuine fear about what Dad might do to correct this perceived rebellion. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. I didn't mean to question anything. I just wanted to understand. "Understanding comes through submission to God's organization," Dad replied, his voice returning to its teaching tone. "When you graduate from high school, you'll begin pioneering like other faithful young sisters. That's God's will for your life, and questioning it shows you need serious spiritual adjustment." That night, after the family study ended and I'd been sent to my room without dinner as part of my spiritual correction, I lay in bed thinking about the conversation and feeling more confused than ever. Everything I'd been taught said that asking questions in search of understanding was good, but my experience consistently showed that questions led to punishment and accusations of spiritual weakness. The breakthrough moment came unexpectedly in early September 1975, during a circuit assembly held at a civic center about an hour's drive from our home. The theme of the assembly was maintaining unity in God's organization, and the talks focused heavily on the importance of loyalty and submission to organizational authority. During the lunch break, I found myself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the building, eating the sandwich Mom had prepared while other families gathered in their usual social groups. I was still feeling isolated and confused after the confrontation with Dad about college, and the assembly talks about unity and loyalty were making me feel even more like an outsider. "You look troubled, dear," a gentle voice said beside me. I looked up to see Sister Martinez, an elderly woman from a congregation in a neighboring city. She was probably in her 70s, with kind eyes and the sort of peaceful demeanor that made people comfortable sharing their problems with her. "Oh, I'm fine," I said automatically, having learned that admitting to spiritual struggles was dangerous, especially with strangers who might report concerns to the local elders. "Sometimes being fine is the hardest thing of all," Sister Martinez said with a knowing smile, settling down beside me with her own lunch. "I've been in the truth for nearly 50 years, and I've learned that questions are often more valuable than answers." Her statement was so contrary to everything I'd been taught that I looked at her in shock. "Questions are valuable? Of course, dear. How else do we grow in understanding?" The Bereans were commended for examining the scriptures to verify what Paul taught them. If it was good for them to question an apostle, surely it's appropriate for us to examine what imperfect men teach today. I glanced around nervously, making sure no one else was listening to our conversation. "But I've been told that questioning the organization is the same as questioning God." Sister Martinez was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a sadness that seemed to come from deep experience. "Child, God is much bigger than any human organization. He can handle our questions, our doubts, even our disagreements. What he can't handle is when we stop thinking and start following men blindly. But what about unity? What about loyalty to God's organization? True unity comes from shared love of truth, not from enforced conformity to human rules," she replied gently. "And loyalty to God sometimes requires disloyalty to men who claim to speak for him, but whose actions contradict his character." This conversation lasted only about 10 minutes before we were called back for the afternoon session, but it had a profound impact on my thinking. For the first time, I'd met someone with long experience in the organization who validated my questions rather than condemning them. Sister Martinez hadn't given me answers, but she'd given me something more valuable: permission to keep asking questions. The weeks following that assembly were marked by a growing sense of internal tension as I began to notice more contradictions between what was taught and what was practiced in our congregation. The emphasis on love and compassion from the platform seemed to contrast sharply with the harsh treatment of anyone who expressed doubts or asked uncomfortable questions. In October 1975, this tension came to a head when our congregation faced a situation that would force me to choose between my growing awareness and my desire to maintain family peace. Brother Williams, the elderly man who had spoken so fondly of my mother's beauty in her youth, was accused of financial improprieties in his role as the congregation's account servant. The details were never made public, but whispered conversations suggested that Brother Williams had been borrowing money from the congregation's funds to cover his own expenses, with the intention of paying it back when his financial situation improved. When the shortage was discovered during a routine audit, the body of elders faced a decision about how to handle the situation. "Brother Williams has confessed his error and expressed deep repentance," Dad announced to our family during a private discussion about the matter. "The body has decided to handle this internally to avoid bringing reproach on Jehovah's name. He'll be reproved privately and removed from his position, but there's no need to involve outside authorities." "What about the money?" I asked, genuinely curious about how the practical problem would be resolved. "Brother Williams will make restitution gradually," Dad replied. "The important thing is that he's shown a repentant heart and wants to make things right with Jehovah." Something about this situation bothered me intensely, though I couldn't initially identify why. Over the following days, as I thought about it more, I realized that my discomfort centered on the question of justice. Brother Williams had committed what seemed to be a crime, stealing money that belonged to the congregation, but he was being protected from the legal consequences of his actions because exposing him might embarrass the organization. This seemed fundamentally different from the harsh treatment given to young people who asked questions about organizational teachings or families who struggled with personal problems. Brother Williams's actual crime was being handled with compassion and discretion, while my intellectual curiosity was being treated as spiritual rebellion worthy of punishment. The contradiction became even more apparent when I learned that Brother Williams would be allowed to continue participating in field service and would likely be reappointed to a position of responsibility once he'd demonstrated sufficient repentance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson, whose only offense had been asking a thoughtful question during our book study, continued to be viewed with suspicion by the elders and was frequently counseled about her attitude. By November 1975, my internal conflict had reached a point where I could no longer maintain the facade of unquestioning faith that was expected of me. I found myself analyzing every talk, every publication, every elder's decision through the lens of logic and fairness rather than automatic acceptance. The more I analyzed, the more problems I found. The breaking point came during a family study session in December 1975. When we were reviewing material about the organization's understanding of biblical prophecy. The publication confidently explained complex prophetic timelines and made specific claims about God's purposes for the near future, including strong implications that the end of the current system of things was imminent. "Dad," I said, interrupting his reading of a particularly confusing paragraph about symbolic numbers and prophetic fulfillments, "how can we be sure that the organization's interpretation of these prophecies is correct? What if they're wrong about the timing?" The question was honest and genuinely curious, but Dad's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face flushed red, and he slammed the book shut with such force that Mom visibly flinched. "That's enough, Rebecca," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I've been patient with your questions, but this is going too far. You're not questioning prophecy. You're questioning God's ability to communicate through his organization. That's apostasy." The word apostasy hung in the air like a death sentence. In our religious community, being labeled an apostate was the worst possible fate, worse than being merely disfellowshipped for moral failings. Apostates were considered enemies of God, tools of Satan, people whose very presence could contaminate faithful witnesses. "I'm not trying to be an apostate," I said, my voice breaking with fear and confusion. "I just want to understand how we know that our interpretation is the right one. What if other religious groups have different explanations for the same scriptures? Other religious groups are part of Babylon the Great," Dad replied, his voice now carrying the cold authority he used during judicial committee meetings. "They're influenced by demons. The fact that you're even considering their teachings shows how far you've fallen spiritually." Mom tried to intervene, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold, maybe she's just confused. Maybe if we studied with her more." "Patricia, this isn't confusion," Dad said, not taking his eyes off me. "This is rebellion. Rebecca has chosen to trust her own understanding rather than God's organization. She needs correction before this poison spreads further." That night, as I lay in bed with fresh bruises hidden beneath my nightgown, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging for months. I no longer believed that the organization spoke for God, and I no longer believed that my father's authority was divinely appointed. The realization was terrifying because it meant that everything I'd been taught about truth, faith, and family was built on a foundation that was crumbling beneath my feet. But along with the terror came something unexpected, a sense of relief that I could finally stop pretending to believe things that made no sense to me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could think clearly without the constant pressure to conform my thoughts to someone else's expectations. The question that remained was what to do with this newfound clarity. I was 15 years old, still living under Dad's complete control, with no resources or support system outside the organization. Speaking my truth would mean losing everything I'd ever known, including my family. But continuing to live a lie was slowly destroying my sense of self. As 1975 drew to a close, I knew that a decision was approaching that would define the rest of my life. I could continue living in silent rebellion, protecting my family relationships by suppressing my authentic thoughts and feelings. Or I could find the courage to speak truthfully about what I'd observed and experienced, regardless of the consequences. The choice would prove to be even more difficult than I imagined, because speaking the truth would require me to do more than just challenge Dad's authority. It would require me to expose the systematic pattern of abuse and control that had shaped my entire childhood, knowing that doing so would forever change how I was viewed by the only community I'd ever known. The moment that changed everything happened on a cold January morning in 1976, 3 weeks after my 16th birthday. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when the phone rang at exactly 7:15, an unusual time for calls in our carefully scheduled household. Dad answered with his customary elder's greeting, "Matthew's residence, Harold speaking." What followed was a conversation that would shatter the last remnants of my willingness to remain silent. "Yes, Brother Peterson," Dad said, his voice dropping to the confidential tone he used for congregation business. "I understand the sensitivity of the situation. No, of course we can't let this become public knowledge. The family's reputation and the congregation's good name must be protected." I continued preparing toast, but every word was burning itself into my memory. Mom entered the kitchen, moving quietly to avoid disturbing Dad's call, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she listened. "The girl is clearly troubled," Dad continued, walking toward his study with the phone cord stretched to its limit. "These accusations against her stepfather are obviously a cry for attention. No, Brother Peterson, I don't think involving outside authorities would be wise. We can handle this internally." My hands froze on the butter knife. They were talking about Sarah Collins, a 14-year-old girl from our congregation whose stepfather, Brother Martinez, was one of Dad's closest friends among the elders. Sarah had been acting strangely for months, withdrawn during meetings, flinching when adults approached her, crying unexpectedly during assemblies. "The committee should focus on helping the girl overcome her rebellious attitude," Dad's voice carried from the study. "Brother Martinez is an exemplary family head. If there are problems in that household, they stem from the girl's lack of submission to proper authority." I set down the knife and walked quietly toward the study, my heart pounding with a mixture of rage and recognition. Through the partially open door, I could see Dad taking notes in his elder's handbook, recording his recommendations for handling Sarah's spiritual problem. "Absolutely, Brother Peterson. We'll arrange for increased shepherding visits to help her understand the proper attitude toward family headship. If she continues making these claims, we may need to consider whether she's bringing reproach on the congregation." The threat was clear. Sarah was in danger of being disfellowshipped for speaking about her abuse. She would lose her family, her friends, her entire support system, not for being abused, but for talking about it. In that moment, watching my father calmly plan the silencing of a 14-year-old victim, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't about organizational policy or biblical interpretation anymore. This was about a child being sacrificed to protect a man's reputation and the organization's image. Dad ended the call and returned to the kitchen, adjusting his tie and checking his watch. "Rebecca, we need to discuss your attitude lately. Brother Peterson mentioned that you've been seen talking to Sister Martinez after meetings. I want you to limit your association with their family during this difficult time." "Difficult time?" I heard myself saying, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "You mean the time when Sarah is being abused by her stepfather?" The silence that followed felt electric. Mom dropped the orange juice glass she'd been holding, and it shattered on the linoleum floor. Dad's face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, and then cold fury. "Rebecca, you will not repeat gossip and slander in this house," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Brother Martinez is a faithful servant of Jehovah, and these accusations are clearly false. The girl is troubled and needs spiritual guidance, not encouragement in her rebellious behavior." "How do you know they're false?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. "Have you investigated? Have you talked to doctors, police, anyone outside the organization? Or are you just protecting your friend because he's an elder? Dad took a step toward me, and I saw the familiar signs that preceded his violent corrections, the tightening around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. But for the first time in my life, I didn't step back. "You're walking on very dangerous ground, young lady," he said. "Questioning the decisions of God's appointed elders is questioning God himself. I won't tolerate apostasy in my household." "Then maybe I don't belong in your household," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. The physical blow came immediately. Dad's open hand across my face with enough force to snap my head to the side. But instead of the usual fear and submission, I felt something else. Clarity. "There it is," I said, tasting blood from my split lip. "That's how you handle problems, isn't it? Hit them until they go away. Just like you're teaching the other elders to hit Sarah's problem until it goes away." "Rebecca, stop," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, honey, just apologize. Don't make this worse." But I couldn't stop. 16 years of suppressed anger and accumulated truth were pouring out of me like water through a broken dam. "No, Mom, I won't stop, and I won't apologize for telling the truth. Dad and his elder friends are more concerned about protecting Brother Martinez's reputation than protecting a 14-year-old girl from being raped. They're going to blame Sarah, disfellowship her if she keeps talking, and let her abuser continue serving as an elder. That's not God's organization. That's a criminal conspiracy." Dad's second blow knocked me to the floor, but I pushed myself up immediately, my vision blurred, but my voice steady. "Hit me again, Dad. Show Mom what God's love looks like according to you. Show her what happens to people who ask questions or tell uncomfortable truths in this house." "Harold, please," Mom said, moving between us with her hands raised. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said, wiping blood from my mouth. "I understand that you've both chosen to serve an organization that protects predators and silences victims. I understand that your version of faith requires covering up crimes and calling it loyalty. And I understand that I can't be part of that anymore." Dad reached for his belt, his face flushed with the rage I'd seen so many times before. "You will not speak about congregation matters with anyone outside this family. You will apologize to Brother Martinez for spreading lies about him, and you will submit to whatever discipline the body of elders decides is appropriate for your apostasy." "No," I said simply. "I won't." The word hung in the air between us like a declaration of war. For 16 years, I had never refused a direct command from my father. The concept of no hadn't existed in my vocabulary when it came to his authority. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. I said no. "I won't apologize for telling the truth. I won't stay silent about abuse, and I won't pretend that protecting your organization is more important than protecting children." I walked toward the kitchen door, my legs shaking, but my resolve firm. "I'm going to school now. When I come home, we can discuss how you plan to handle having a daughter who refuses to participate in covering up child abuse. But I won't be silenced anymore." As I reached for my backpack, Dad's voice followed me. "If you walk out that door without submitting to my authority, don't bother coming back. You'll be dead to this family." I turned to look at him one last time. This man who had controlled every aspect of my life through fear and violence, disguised as divine love. "Then I guess I'll learn to live with being dead to you, because I can't live with being dead to myself anymore." The front door closed behind me with a quiet click that sounded like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The walk to school that January morning felt like moving through a different world. Every familiar landmark, the corner grocery store where Mom bought our weekly supplies, the bus stop where congregation members gathered for field service, the small park where I'd played as a child, seemed transformed by my decision. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more distinct, as if I'd been living my entire life with dulled senses and had suddenly awakened. But alongside this strange sense of liberation came waves of terror that made my hands shake as I gripped my backpack straps. I had just declared war against the only life I'd ever known, and I had no plan for what came next. At school, I moved through my morning classes in a fog, unable to concentrate on algebra problems or English literature when my entire universe had shifted overnight. During lunch break, I found myself sitting alone in the library, staring at books without seeing them, trying to process what I'd done and what it would mean. "Rebecca, are you okay?" I looked up to see Jennifer Walsh, a classmate I'd known since elementary school, but had never been close to because of the unspoken barrier between witness and non-witness students. Her concerned expression suggested that my internal turmoil was more visible than I'd realized. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then stopped myself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine at all." Jennifer sat down across from me, her math textbook forgotten. "Want to talk about it?" Sometimes it helps to tell someone who's not involved in whatever's going on. For a moment, I considered maintaining the careful privacy that had been drilled into me since childhood. Congregation business stayed within the congregation, family problems stayed within the family. But I'd already crossed that line by challenging Dad's authority. What harm could come from crossing it further? "My father is covering up child abuse," I said quietly, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "A girl in our church is being hurt by her stepfather, and instead of helping her, the church leaders are trying to silence her to protect the man's reputation." Jennifer's eyes widened. "That's horrible. Have you told the police?" The question was so simple, so obvious, that it took me a moment to respond. In our religion, we're supposed to handle problems internally. Going to outside authorities is considered disloyal unless the church gives permission. "But we're talking about child abuse," Jennifer said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "Doesn't protecting children matter more than protecting the church's reputation?" "That's exactly what I said to my father this morning," I replied. "He hit me and told me I was dead to the family if I didn't submit to his authority and stay silent about the situation." Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, then reached across the table and gently touched the bruise that was forming on my cheek. "Rebecca, this isn't normal. Fathers aren't supposed to hit their children for asking questions or expressing concerns about abuse. And churches aren't supposed to cover up crimes." Her words should have been comforting, but instead they intensified my sense of displacement. If what I'd experienced wasn't normal, then what did that say about the 16 years I'd spent believing it was not only normal, but divinely ordained? "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "If I go home, I'll have to apologize and promise to stay quiet about everything. But I can't do that knowing that Sarah is still in danger. And if I don't go home, if you don't go home, what happens? I lose everything. My family, my friends, my entire community. In our religion, when someone is cut off from the congregation, faithful members aren't allowed to associate with them anymore. My own mother won't be able to talk to me." Jennifer was quiet for several minutes, apparently trying to process the enormity of what I was describing. Finally, she spoke. "Rebecca, I know this is going to sound crazy, but what if losing all of that is actually a good thing? What if you're not losing a loving family and community, but escaping from people who would rather protect abusers than victims?" The possibility she was suggesting felt both terrifying and liberating. Could it be that what I'd always thought of as love and protection had actually been control and manipulation? Could it be that being rejected by such a system would be a blessing rather than a tragedy? The rest of the school day passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and desperate planning. I had nowhere to go except home, but returning home would mean surrendering everything I'd fought for that morning. As the final bell rang, I realized I needed to make one stop before facing whatever awaited me. I walked to the local library and asked to use their phone book. After several minutes of searching, I found the number for the County Child Protective Services office. My hands were trembling as I dialed. "Child Protective Services, this is Maria speaking." "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to report a case of child abuse." The conversation that followed was both easier and more difficult than I'd expected. Maria asked careful questions about Sarah's situation, took down relevant details, and explained the process for investigating such reports. When I mentioned that the abuse was being covered up by religious leaders, her tone became particularly serious. "This type of institutional cover-up is more common than people realize," she said. "Religious organizations sometimes believe they can handle these situations internally. But child abuse is a crime that requires professional intervention. We'll need to investigate immediately." "What about the girl's safety?" I asked. "The church leaders are planning to discipline her for speaking about the abuse. They might disfellowship her, which would mean losing contact with her entire support system. We'll take immediate steps to ensure her protection, Maria assured me. And thank you for calling. Many people know about abuse situations, but don't report them because they're afraid of the consequences. You're potentially saving this child's life. After hanging up the phone, I sat in the library parking lot for nearly an hour, watching the winter sun set behind the mountains and trying to summon the courage to go home. I knew that what I'd just done would be considered the ultimate betrayal by my family and congregation. I'd taken kingdom business to outside authorities, violating one of the organization's most fundamental rules. When I finally walked through our front door at 6:30, the house felt different, charged with tension and barely contained fury. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with his elder's handbook open in front of him, apparently preparing for the judicial committee meeting that would decide my fate. Mom was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like beef stew, but her movements were mechanical and her face was streaked with dried tears. "You're late," Dad said without looking up from his notes. "I had something important to take care of," I replied, setting my backpack by the door. "Nothing you have to do is more important than coming home to face the consequences of your rebellion this morning," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "We have a judicial committee meeting scheduled for tomorrow evening. Brother Peterson and Brother Williams will be joining me to address your apostasy and determine whether you can remain part of this congregation." I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would seal my fate permanently. "That won't be necessary." I called Child Protective Services this afternoon and reported Sarah's abuse. They're opening an investigation, which means the police will probably be contacting Brother Martinez and the other elders soon. The silence that followed was absolute. Mom's spoon clattered to the floor. Dad's face went through several shades of color before settling on a pale gray that made him look older than his 50 years. "You did what?" he whispered. "I protected a child," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I did what you and the other elders should have done weeks ago. I made sure that Sarah's safety became more important than Brother Martinez's reputation." Dad stood up slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles went white. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've brought reproach on Jehovah's name. You've opened the organization to public scrutiny and potential lawsuits. You've destroyed Brother Martinez's life and his family's standing in the community." "I've protected a 14-year-old girl from being raped by her stepfather," I replied. "If that brings reproach on your organization, then maybe your organization deserves reproach." "Get out," Dad said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out of my house right now. You are no longer my daughter. Your name will never be spoken in this household again." I looked at Mom, hoping for some sign of support or understanding, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her loyalty to Dad and the organization was complete, even when it meant losing her only child. "Mom?" I said softly. She shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "I can't, Rebecca. If your father says you're dead to us, then you're dead to us. I have to support his decision as the head of this household." I walked to my room and quickly packed a small suitcase with essential clothes and the money I'd saved from babysitting jobs over the past 2 years. As I gathered my belongings, I could hear Dad on the phone, probably calling Brother Peterson to report that his daughter had committed the ultimate act of treachery against the organization. 20 minutes later, I stood at the front door with my suitcase in one hand and my school backpack in the other. The house where I'd lived my entire life suddenly felt like a place I'd never belonged. "I love you both," I said to my parents, who were standing in the kitchen doorway watching my departure. "And I hope someday you'll understand that protecting children is more important than protecting organizations." Neither of them responded. As I closed the door behind me and walked into the cold January night, I knew I was truly alone for the first time in my life. But I also knew that somewhere across town, Sarah Collins would be safer tonight, because someone had finally chosen to protect her rather than her abuser. The fear was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something I'd never experienced before: the knowledge that I'd acted with genuine courage and integrity, regardless of the personal cost. 27 years have passed since that cold January night when I walked away from everything I'd ever known. As I sit in my home office now, watching the morning sun stream through windows that I chose, in a house that I bought with money I earned through my own efforts, I'm still sometimes amazed by the life I've built from the ashes of my childhood. The first year after leaving home was the hardest period of my existence. I slept on Jennifer Walsh's family couch for 3 months, while her parents, kind people who couldn't understand how a church could abandon a 16-year-old for protecting an abused child, helped me navigate the legal process of becoming an emancipated minor. The Walshes never made me feel like a burden, but I knew I needed to find my own path. I finished high school while working part-time at a local diner, studying late into the night by the light of a desk lamp in the tiny studio apartment I rented with my wages. College had seemed like an impossible dream when Dad dismissed it as spiritually dangerous, but it became my lifeline to a different future. I earned scholarships, took student loans, and worked multiple jobs to put myself through university, eventually graduating with a degree in social work. The irony wasn't lost on me that the education Dad had forbidden became the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting vulnerable children, the very principle that had cost me my family. Sarah Collins and I reconnected during my sophomore year of college. The investigation I'd triggered had resulted in her stepfather's arrest and conviction, and she'd been placed with relatives in another state. She called me after finding my contact information through mutual acquaintances who'd left the organization. "Rebecca," she said during that emotional phone conversation, "I want you to know that reporting the abuse saved my life. Not just because it stopped what was happening to me, but because it showed me that someone believed me enough to risk everything to protect me." Sarah went on to become a therapist specializing in religious trauma, and we've remained close friends ever since. She often tells people that my decision to speak up taught her that her safety and dignity were worth more than any organization's reputation, a lesson that shaped her entire approach to helping other survivors. The complete estrangement from my parents lasted for 15 years. During that time, I sent birthday cards and Christmas letters to the house where I'd grown up, never receiving responses, but hoping that somehow my words might reach the part of them that had once loved me unconditionally. I graduated college, started my career, fell in love, got married, and began building the family I'd always dreamed of having, all while carrying the pain of being completely cut off from my origins. The breakthrough came in 1993, when Mom called me at work on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was older, more fragile than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "Rebecca, it's Mom." I nearly dropped the phone. "Mom, is everything okay? Is Dad—" "Your father is fine," she said quickly. "Well, not fine exactly. He's been struggling with some health problems, and it's made him think about things he might have done differently. About you." That conversation led to a series of careful, tentative meetings that gradually rebuilt some version of a relationship between us. Dad never fully apologized for his treatment of me, or acknowledged that I'd been right to report Sarah's abuse, but he did admit that he'd been too harsh in cutting me off completely. "I thought I was protecting the congregation," he told me during one of our awkward coffee meetings. "I believed that loyalty to the organization was the same as loyalty to God. It took me years to understand that God doesn't require parents to abandon their children." Dad passed away in 2018, and our relationship at the time of his death was cordial but distant. He'd softened considerably in his later years, quietly questioning some of the organization's policies while never having the courage to leave entirely. Mom and I now have regular contact, though we carefully avoid discussing religious topics that might reopen old wounds. My professional life has been deeply influenced by those early experiences with institutional abuse and cover-ups. I've spent my career working with children and families affected by religious trauma, helping them navigate the complex process of healing from spiritual abuse while rebuilding their sense of identity and self-worth. In 2010, I established the Matthews Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance, counseling services, and temporary housing for individuals leaving high-control religious groups. We've helped hundreds of families transition out of environments where questioning doctrine or reporting abuse is punished by total social isolation. The Foundation's work has brought me into contact with survivors from dozens of different religious organizations, all sharing similar patterns of control, manipulation, and institutional protection of abusers. What I learned in my childhood, that power structures often prioritize their own preservation over the welfare of vulnerable members, proved to be tragically universal. Some of the most rewarding moments in my work have come from reuniting families torn apart by religious shunning policies. Last year, we helped a grandmother reconnect with grandchildren she hadn't seen in a decade because their parents had left their church and been declared dead to faithful members. The joy in that woman's face when she held her granddaughter for the first time in 10 years reminded me why this work matters so deeply. My own family life has been a conscious effort to create everything I'd missed in childhood. My husband David, whom I met in graduate school, comes from a completely different background, but shares my commitment to honest communication and unconditional love. Our 2 children, Emily, now 22, and Michael, 19, have grown up knowing they're loved, regardless of their beliefs, questions, or life choices. We've raised them with exposure to many different spiritual traditions, while emphasizing that their worth as human beings doesn't depend on adherence to any particular doctrine. Both kids have watched me work with religious trauma survivors, and they've developed a deep appreciation for the importance of protecting vulnerable people from institutional abuse. Emily recently graduated from college with a degree in journalism and has expressed interest in investigative reporting about religious organizations that systematically cover up abuse. Michael is studying law with plans to specialize in civil rights cases involving religious freedom and institutional accountability. "Mom," Emily told me last month, "growing up with the stories of people you've helped taught me that the most important thing in life is standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, even when it costs you everything." The ripple effects of that January morning in 1976 continue to spread in ways I could never have imagined. The scared 16-year-old who walked away from her family to protect an abused child couldn't have envisioned the life of purpose and meaning that would grow from that moment of moral courage. I still think about the alternate timeline where I stayed silent, apologized to Dad, and lived the rest of my life as a compliant member of the organization. That version of Rebecca would have avoided the pain of family estrangement, the struggle of building an independent life, the challenges of confronting institutional corruption. But she also would have missed the profound satisfaction of using her voice to protect others, the joy of authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than fearful submission, and the peace that comes from living according to conscience rather than external pressure. To anyone listening to this story who might be facing similar choices, whether in religious communities, family systems, or any other situation where truth-telling comes with devastating social costs, I want you to know that courage is possible, healing is available, and building a life of integrity is worth whatever it costs. The truth really does set you free, even when freedom feels terrifying at first. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.